Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, is our Vice President of Research, Derek Cohen. Hey, Derek, how's it going today?
Not too bad. Not too bad. I think we got a special treat for the crowd.
Well, you know, it is a trend among podcasts that instead of doing their own content on the podcast, they're going to take content from other podcasts and make it their podcast. And so we're going to try that phenomenon today. It is a trend amongst other podcasts. We're going to try that today. Here, you can set it up a little bit better than me, but you had an opportunity to interview Dan McLaughlin, who's senior writer at National Review Online, on a number of different subjects. So why don't you tell the people what the interview is about, and then we'll roll it.
Yeah, it was a very, very interesting discussion just to set the table. So when our intern classes come in, we have a curriculum set up called Philosophy of Freedom, really kind of going through the intellectual history of conservatism, you know, going all the way back to, you know, to Burke, if not Runnymede and before that, you know. And one of the things that we've looked to do this year, and I have to give credit to both Zach McHugh and Aaron Valdez, who've spearheaded this as well, is we really looked at redesigning the curriculum. You might remember that this is something that Kevin envisioned when he was here. Oh, geez, I believe our first Philosophy of Freedom class might have been in 16 or 17, you know, which, as we know, was about 20, 30 years ago. And, you know, the content was good when he did it. You know, he had that solid through line on conservative philosophy because, you know, coming from as a former master of a college, a former headmaster of a school, he was able to actually trace that through. Now, when he left, we obviously had to divvy up that. And so I think the people that we have on the different segments right now are absolutely great. I'm bookending it. I'm doing the opening one that we're about to discuss, as well as the closing one. But then we also have like subject matter experts, like our own Chance Weldon, who we've had on the show before, comes in and does one on kind of the animating principle of the founding. Josh Trevino does the Texas and American constitutions. You know, just it's a great program. But under this new rubric, we really wanted to kick it off with basically a well-known thinker on the matter, and really just have an open discussion and set the table for I think we're up to 8 or 9 modules in this curriculum now. And this conversation was no different. I guess if we had to call it anything, we'd call it, we talked about Tocqueville, Trump, and taking a base, because we definitely covered baseball on the front end and the back end, as well as a lot of the undergirding of American politics going all the way back to the founding up to the present day.
Well, great. Well, if you'll permit us, we're going to get a little bit intellectual for once on this show, instead of the normal current events and hot takes and bad jokes, of course. So with that, Jefferson, roll it.
Without further ado, I'd like to just jump right in and introduce from National Review, Dan McLaughlin, who's a senior writer over there. You may have read some of his other stuff prior to at Red State, The Federalist, baseballcrank.com is the website that he runs. We're going to talk a little bit about baseball today as well. And just really looking forward to getting this conversation started. For those who haven't participated in this program before, this is obviously our kind of level set for our intern class. We really like to walk them through why it is we do what we do here, why it is we believe what we believe, and really kind of use that as the foundation for the policy work that we do. So without further ado, Dan, if you'd like to come up here and join me.
Thanks for having me here.
Oh,
Just got to flip that on.
there we go.
It's always better when it's on.
That's okay. The AV folks in the back tell me I oftentimes don't need a microphone, so that's something I've been told before. So I want to jump right in. So obviously, Baseball Crank, that's your Twitter handle. People know you as that online. You've obviously opined on many things. I think it's a good jumping off point because baseball in and of itself is a good proxy for our politics, specifically on the conservative side. We've had the many stories of George Will. I think he follows a small team in Washington. Really unsure of their name at the moment, but obviously big proxy for politics. So let me just wade right into that. Mr. Baseball Crank, and ask you, where are we at on the universal designated hitter, on the ghost runner, on the pitch clock, all these new innovations in that particular?
Yeah, I mean, innovation is a hard thing in baseball because it's such a traditional sport, and I think that is one reason why we associate baseball with a certain style of the conservative mind, in a sense. Although obviously football appeals to a different side of that. The ghost runner to me is heresy. That is absolutely heresy, because
That is a correct take, sir.
yes, I like to say that one of the things about the pitch clock, to compare it to the pitch clock, the concept of the pitch clock is to reduce the time, between plays when nothing's happening. So ultimately, even though the pitch clock is a bit of a break with tradition, it is intended to give you more baseball in your baseball game. And the ghost runner is intended to give you less baseball in your baseball game. And that's bad. It hastens the end of an extra inning game. And I mean, particularly as a New York Mets fan, I grew up with many, many legendary, bizarrely long extra inning games, which is a great highlight of the game.
Excellent. And so universal designated hitters. Now that's a more controversial one, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I find it sad as a longtime National League fan. I prefer, the old way of doing things without the designated hitter, or, failing that, the distinctiveness of the different culture of the two leagues based on there being one DH and one not.
If we had 100 Otanis, we could have a more three-dimensional conversation about that. But I definitely agree with that particular thing. So I want to kind of take a step back, because we're still talking about the broader underpinnings of conservative philosophy here. So just for folks not familiar, can you kind of describe your, I would say, ideological evolution? Did you have a libertarian phase in college that you grew out of, and how did you end up where you are?
No. I mean, look, frankly, I was born in 1971. So when I say that I'm a Reaganite, I'm Reaganite through and through, beginning to end. I came of age with Reagan. I grew up listening to Reagan and watching Reagan, more so even than like reading columnists or listening to the radio or reading political philosophers. So for me, everything starts with Reagan and goes from there, which is not a bad place to start, not only because he was great and we were so terribly spoiled, our generation, as we've seen since then, but because I think when you read the great political philosophers and commentators and theorists, I think there's no substitute for the political philosophers who have been in the arena. And who have developed their ideas. Political science is the science of human beings. It is a science of human beings. I guess there are other efforts at that, but it's, there's a great value to people who can associate that with actually having done politics, and have learned something, people like Burke and Tocqueville who, wrote some of their great works while they were in office or or after being in office.
That's actually a great segue into a point I wanted to hit while we're kind of in this part of this phase of the discussion. You had a 4-part series on Tocqueville, probably about a couple months ago, we'll say, online. And I thought that was fascinating, because a lot of folks, specifically on the conservative side, when we talk about Tocqueville, we really like to focus about Tocqueville's time in America. But your perspective was balanced, and it definitely focused heavily on the actual experience in France. Can you give us kind of a synopsis of your 4-part series, and specifically extracting those individual lessons that apply to what we're experiencing today?
Yeah, because I mean, Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America when he was a very young man. So that actually he wrote before he had been in politics, and it made a name for him that got him into politics. But he wrote another book called Reflections. I think the original title in French is Souvenirs, which is, the more proper translation. But he wrote it about the 1848 revolution in France, and at which point he had been in office for over a decade and was at the peak of his career. He was in his early 40s. He was around the same age as Louis Napoleon, who ultimately comes out of that revolution as the elected president of France and later stages a coup to eliminate the Second Republic. And so what Tocqueville traces goes all the way from the collapse of the monarchy in February of 1848 to sort of the descent of France into a certain amount of disorder, the attempt of the socialists to have a socialist revolutionary government, which was terribly unsuccessful. And then ultimately you have the people elect by a massive margin Louis Napoleon, who spends about 2 years in office as the elected president before he stages a coup and then later becomes emperor. And the lessons, Tocqueville sort of starts with, I kind of walked through how each of these different stages failed, right? And the lesson for that is so much about the political culture, that we see some of the same signs of a decayed political culture and a decayed political class in America today. It looks familiar to us. And Tocqueville is a brilliant aphorist, so he has, a great one-liner or a sketch of a character on every page. But, he gave this speech in January of 1848, just before the revolution, warning that, like, when a political class is unfit to rule, that's when the government falls. And he gives this sort of thundering peroration about, don't even worry about changing the laws. Change the laws if you must, but change the spirit of the government. It is driving you into the ditch, driving you into the abyss. And so many of the different, I could go at length, but so many of the different stages of things that happened are things that we see in our own system. For example, he says, looking back on this speech, he's like, it didn't make that much of an impression because everybody in the French assembly was so used to saying, my enemies are terrible and the state is doomed and all of this catastrophizing rhetoric. And they're so accustomed to it. He's like, looking back, he's like, I'm not sure I even believed it myself. And he gave this big speech, gentlemen were sleeping on the side of a volcano. And yet, because they were so accustomed to dealing in doom, saying, as a routine matter, that they didn't see it coming when it finally came. And one of the things, for example, there was the banquet movement, right? Because these moderate, middle class, smaller Republicans who wanted to push reform on the monarchy, they were holding meetings across the country, which were in classic French styled as banquets. And there's a showdown with the king. And the king, who is 74 and he doesn't have the vitality that he once had, he doesn't crack down on them directly, but he basically, as Tocqueville put it, they agreed to a duel at the bar of justice, right? The king was going to try to let them go through with their last banquet in Paris and then have them brought up on charges, which is, again, something that we see in our own system right now, which is the political class kind of punting issues into the courts and into the prosecutorial system and the judges. Another thing, for example, that happens then is the monarchy collapses. As Tocqueville says, the government wasn't overthrown, it was allowed to fall. And the socialists think, oh, this is our moment now. The king is gone. And they have universal suffrage. We're going to have elections all across the country. We're going to elect an assembly, and now the people will rule. The socialists are like all from Paris, right? They have forgotten or not considered the fact that most of the country is farmers who own their own land. They're not really all that hot to abolish private property. And so they elect this assembly that is totally uninterested in socialism. I mean, one of the things that's funny to me too is reading. Tocqueville was from Normandy. This is actually enormously important. He was not a Parisian, so he did not fall. He had a more Anglo-American contacts and outlook, and he didn't fall into the trap of thinking that Paris was France. But, it's interesting to read to his account of going back and campaigning for votes, in places like Cherbourg and St. Lo, because, you think of what those names meant to the cause of liberty a century later than 1848.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to make, specifically that, while we're talking about, and this is actually the one time that we actually can accurately apply the actual seating arrangement of the General Assembly on the left and the right. Whereas you had the folks on the left that Dan just mentioned. But, if we put this in the modern parlance, far be it from me to say that the current day GOP is the reinvigoration of the Girondin, right? And so I think that it's really important to understand
that the reason, much for the reasons you listed, that the failure of the French Revolution, its descent into its myriad failures, also kind of comes from the intellectual animation of the revolution unto itself. There's a lot of contrasting between the Scottish Enlightenment, which was largely, I would argue, largely influential of the American Revolution, versus the French Enlightenment, which, at least titularly called such, which really almost, other than having the E word, really doesn't have much values in common. How do you see what happened in the American experience different from which you just outlined in the French?
I mean, our revolution, first of all, was to a large part, sometimes this is overstated by conservative writers. It was in many ways a conservative revolution. It was intended to preserve liberties of, Englishmen, the traditional liberties of Englishmen in the American colonies that they felt the king was trampling on. And so it was not intended as a social revolution, even though, as people like Bernard Bailyn have written, it did affect a social revolution by spreading these kind of small R Republican mores throughout society that it broke down some of this sort of patriarchal culture of in which sort of the gentleman is at the top and everyone else is a dependent of him in one way or another, the indentured servants and all that, which has downstream effects because that's what kind of isolates slavery, because slavery didn't seem as out of character and out of place in a society that was like that as it did in a society that was obsessed with the idea of, every man's equality with every other. But at the same time, there were things that the revolution changed enormously in America, and that were grating on, some of the influential colonists. And some of that was just that they wanted to expand west and the British government wouldn't let them. But when you look at the economic system, I did a piece on this a little while ago about George Washington and his role in the economy. I mean, the revolution, before the revolution, there were enormous restrictions on what could be domestically manufactured. There were trade barriers between the different colonies. And so, there was not money. There literally they were out of money. There wasn't enough money in circulation to have the liquidity that an economy needs. And so all of this is changed by the revolution and later by the Constitution. It creates this national market that is geographically larger than any country in Europe. Mm-hmm. It creates the free trade zone internally. It creates currency. Under Hamilton, they're able to establish something like sound national currency, and do away with a lot of the dependence on, for example, being able to start a company. You didn't need to get a royal charter from the governor or from, well-connected people in London. Mm-hmm. State could just let you start a business. And so that affected an economic revolution that I think is sometimes underrated when we think about the difference between America in 1774 and America in 1796 at the end of the Washington administration.
Now, can I characterize that? And again, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but the economic revolution, and I think that's a very interesting point and one that's not made very frequently. Do you think that the essential nature of the economic part of the revolution is one based I'll not say solely, but largely on decentralization, which is I would say a great précis into autonomy?
Yeah, it's decentralizing, but it's not totally decentralizing. It's not totally decentralizing in the sense that Washington and Hamilton were nationalists, right? They did want there to be a national market. And so in that sense, they didn't want state particularism and local particularism to override a national market. But other than that part of it, yes, it was decentralizing. It was removing, royal power and distant across the ocean parliamentary power from, local economic activity.
Excellent. I appreciate that, Dan. And I want to ask, because I think that this is, as we approach the modern day and applying some of the philosophical items that we've discussed, I don't know whether it was Trump touching the orb in Saudi Arabia or the death of Harambe, but obviously the world right now, I would say,
the Cubs winning the World Series.
That's. I was about to say we could unpack the latent evil in that, but that's probably its own standalone program. Make sure nobody out here is a Cubs fan, but we definitely, and I think that it is appropriate to say that we look at the current body politic and the current state of politics as it is, and we tend to see things all through this interpretive lens of Trump, right? And I think that's, while that's a bit overdetermined, I also think it's a little bit lazy, because my take on that would essentially be Trump as a man, or as a man ascendant into the political sphere, is more of a symptom as opposed to a cause of all the things that we lament in this current system. So what is your kind of prognosis of this current political moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to separate sort of Trump now from Trump in 2015, 2016. And I think that there's a lot of danger actually in people trying to prognosticate the election or how Trump would be in office if he is elected from the lens of 2016. You know, we're 8 years later. He's 8 years older. He's been through a lot of experiences that have changed his own view of some things. I agree that if you look at the rise of Trump, that Trump is as much at that point a symptom as a cause. I mean, yes, there's a cause. The cause, of his specific rise does have a lot to do with his personality, his enormous fame, just his ability to attract all of this media attention and suck it away from his rivals for the nomination. But there's no question that there was a lot of pent-up frustration within the Republican Party and the Republican primary electorate, and there has been a breach of trust between the Republican grassroots and the party leadership, and I think it goes in both directions too. It's particularly since 2016 that I think you have the sort of traditional party establishment has kind of lost faith in the voters, as well as the other way around. But where we are now, though, I think is that we're in a situation where Trump himself has an enormous impact, which I think is a bad impact in terms of, I think he's now at the point where, he's a kind of a revolutionary figure. And sometimes throughout history, revolutionary figures who are not themselves necessarily virtuous figures can still do great things just by, arriving and shaking things up. But often you need to have a transition from the revolutionary figure to somebody who actually runs things. Mm-hmm. The American Revolution was even a little bit like that, in the sense that, our first president wasn't Sam Adams. But Washington was unusual in being a successful revolutionary and a successful founder. But I do think that we're in a point where there's a lot of things that both the Republican Party and sort of the conservative and conservative/libertarian movements need to be doing in terms of thinking about policy, thinking about activism, thinking about ideas, thinking about recruiting of new people into the movement. And I really do think that Trump is now standing and winning elections. And I think Trump has been standing in the way a lot of that, of the point where the party's broke and has trouble attracting, has trouble keeping people recruited to run for office, and has trouble getting a conversation out there about issues and that sort of thing.
Am I to understand you correctly that you're saying that George Santos is not the next George Washington?
Well, it might be on his resume.
It actually lists George Washington. That's very, very much so. But no, I want to kind of unpack that, because you hit on something important, specifically the terms of thinking of policy and growing the coalition, growing the tent. What do you think are some of those items? And I'm not asking you, what should be the prototypical 2.0 of the Republican platform or anything like that. But in broad strokes, what do you think kind of are the areas that maybe under a Reaganite fusionist understanding of large R republicanism that incorporates small r republicanism, what are some of the items that need to be part of that conversation?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to be unduly pessimistic in the sense that, leadership, it always surprises us how much not only leadership matters, but how much leadership can change things, right? There's a reason that the Republican Party went from the party of Nixon to the party of Reagan like that, and from the party of Bush to the party of Trump. When there's a new leader in town, people will follow the leader more than you would think. And oh boy, if you look down the ranks of people who talk and write about Republican politics, and you listen to how some of them sounded in 2003 compared to how, say on foreign policy, compared to how some of those same people sound today, leadership does make a very big difference. But I do think, one of the things I think that fusionism historically, right, there was this movement in the late 50s and early 60s centered at National Review, to have this big argument about what conservatism is and find a way to fuse together, in a sense. And fusionism, like so many movements in political history, was named by its opponents. But it was, essentially the idea that the pursuit of virtue and the pursuit of liberty were not necessarily at odds. They were not enemies. That the greater space, private space you created away from the government, the greater space there was for both institutions and individuals to develop civic virtue and personal virtue. But the elements have not always been fused in exactly the same way throughout the history of the movement or the party. I think, look, if you go back to the very beginning of the Republican Party was very classically liberally oriented, right? And Lincoln is probably the most pure classical liberal we've ever had as a president. But from the very beginning, that was, as an organization, maybe more so than an explicit philosophy, it was fused with the culture of the Midwest and American nationalism and, Victorian era Christian moralism. I think Grant, if you look at Grant's presidency, and Grant is such an underrated figure in American history, although he's, as some would say, being recognized more and more. But, it embodies a lot of that side, actually, of the party. And there are others. Seward, for example, Lincoln's Secretary of State, is very much an aggressive American nationalist, even though he's, in domestic politics, very much cut from the same cloth as Lincoln. But anyway, the different elements don't always have to fuse in exactly the same way, at least in terms of the political movement. I think there's what I've called the new republicanism, which is a not yet fully formed thing, but it is something that I think we've seen, some of the governors leading the way on, DeSantis and Abbott and Youngkin and Kemp and some of the other, Republican governors who have been trying to deal with this question of private power. What republicanism, if you think about what is republicanism, right? The simple answer is, well, the republic is a country without a king, right? But it's also a country without an entrenched aristocracy. It is the idea, and it was very big in the early republic, right? The idea of, that we were against having these entrenched groups that had power that couldn't be removed by elections, couldn't be removed by the forces of the market, that the ordinary person didn't get a say in whether or not these people had a kind of permanent position at the top, right? The Jacksonians were big on that. And then the reaction against the Jacksonians was big on that too, right? Because the early Republican Party starts to look at the slave power as an entrenched aristocratic kind of thing, whereas the Jacksonians looked at the bankers that way. And so we have that again today. We have this question of, the leaders in journalism and academia and all these institutions, the administrative state. There's all these people that we can't remove by elections, and we also can't remove them by the market. And what do you do with that? And how much of that is something the government can or should do something about? Certainly, I think the government can and should do less to prop up and support those people and institutions. But how do you break some of that power without breaking your fundamental principles about the liberty of private spaces? It's a question that has not been fully answered.
I really like that you harken back to the genesis of National Review, because I think that illustrates
one of the ecological factors that brand of conservatism really fostered it. And I think that is basically countervailing the threat of communism. Anti-communism was a very, very cohesive motive on the left end, or I shouldn't say on the far left, but at least across both political parties at the time. So anti-communism was a very strong animating principle. Nowadays, and we're going to get into this here in a minute with our little modern day Walter Duranty, but nowadays we tend to see there is no, I would say, unifying adversary. Might there be one arising?
Yeah. I mean, look, anti-communism was not only a unifying factor on the right, it was a clarifying factor on the left, right? It forced the center left, the liberals, to define themselves, and even forced socialists to define themselves as, we're socialists, we're not communists, right? And it required them to develop a language to do that. Is there a single unifying adversary out there? Obviously, it's not, it's not the Hamas and other Islamic groups, Iran. It's not Russia. It could be China. It maybe should be all of those things acting together as a de facto new axis, which I think they are. But Americans Americans won't think of them that way until something even more dramatic happens than what's already happened. And there's been a lot of dramatic events on the global stage in the past 2 years. At the same time, look, if aliens landed from another planet and invaded us, Reagan used to have a line about this, about the little green men arriving from outer space, but it's entirely possible that they would succeed in dividing us along our existing lines, right? When Cortez arrived in Mexico, the indigenous tribes didn't all unite against him. They were like, "Oh, this guy's going to get rid of the Aztecs."
I think that's a very illustrating point. One of the segments I teach in this curriculum, I like to say that, again, paraphrasing Reagan. I guarantee if the aliens landed, whether it's on the National Mall or up the street at the Texas Capitol, they come out of their spaceship. They say, "Look, we bring you abundant, limitless energy, the cure for all known diseases." And the first thing that most of these folks that we would consider kind of the elites in public discourse going, "Yeah, but what do you think about that whole Fannie Willis thing yesterday?" And I think that it's one of those.
How does this affect Donald Trump?
Yeah, exactly. You guys don't have any space indictments, do you? But be that as it may, I think that's also kind of these fault lines that you talk about. It's starting to get illustrative of where we're seeing, because we see on the right this insurgency of using some of the language you've already used. I don't know what better way of phrasing it than things that are fundamentally in political philosophy what would be known as radicals, on the right, conservative, or well, at least reactionary anti-institutionalists. And, people that have already proclaimed that the American experiment is done, that everything is, a steaming pile of rubble with drag queen story hours being hosted on it, and that there is no policy prescription by which to get out of this. And now, obviously, policy being downstream from culture, I understand that that's a bit of a simplification. But that being said, is how do you diagnose the thing on right? We just saw, I mentioned Walter Duranty earlier. We saw Tucker, talking about how great, Moscow subway stations are, the fact that they have both beets and leeks in their grocery stores. But we generally run into the problem of, that's, it makes people might scratch, I would say people that aren't that well read on this might scratch their beard and say, But what we don't see is any sort of further conversation about the fact that today the political leader of the opposition died. Is no longer with us. Yeah, asterisk.
Yeah, died of causes that are either very directly or slightly more indirectly the work of Vladimir Putin. And I mean, look, obviously the great question is, and then what, right? And that, I mean, to a certain extent, even though Tucker Carlson, I think, has probably done more in the past week to discredit himself than he has done before. And look, I'm no fan of Tucker. I think he's done and said a lot of things that were, not true or, morally bad or both. But what I think is uniquely damaging to him about toadying to Putin in this sense, and not being just kind of anti-Putin, but being sort of pro-regime, pro the Russian regime, and trying to tell people that things are fine in Russia, is that I think it undermines his brand, because he's supposed to be the skeptic, right? The guy who asks questions, sometimes even the questions that are a little crazy to ask, but hey, maybe the little green men have already been here. But I think it's damaging. But at the end of the day, part of the reason there's an audience for what Tucker has been selling is that the American people, even I think a lot of Americans who sympathize greatly with Ukraine still have this question of, okay, but then what? Like, how are we actually going to, is it worth the money, or how are we actually going to beat these guys in a war? Is it worth the attempt? Is it just going to be something we're bogged down paying for years and years and years?
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to latch onto, because what we generally see, obviously, we have good folks here in the building, not just in our intern program, but generally, who do come to different conclusions on that particular policy question. And the world is a far more complex and nuanced place than West equals unmitigated good, authoritarianism equals unmitigated bad. But to your point, to equivocate between the two require absolutely just hurdling over dozens of bright lines that have been established, not just in foreign policy convention, civic discourse, but of morality as well. And so I think that one of the issues that we've seen there is not this, that it's happening on the right, of which we just illustrated. It's happening on the left as well, and we're bouncing them off each other. For example, so we're here downtown Austin. We're about 4 or 5 blocks from the start of Texas's 35th congressional district, held by Greg Casaro, a former city councilman here, famously of the Defund the Police movement. His biggest contribution to the national political discourse was he once forgot to take a drink of water for a few hours in order to protest a bill that says that cities aren't lawmakers unto themselves. And this is kind of indicative, in my mind, this is indicative of this performative nature that specifically Congress. I'm not saying that other institutions haven't had their own little 3-ring circuses too, but it almost is now foundational that the American legislature, that Congress, it's more about doing the sprays on Fox. It's about getting the click. It's about delivering a sermon in front of an empty chamber. What can we do, or what can be done at all to arrest that slide into pure performance, bread and circuses?
Yeah, I mean, I have a disagreement with our current Congress. I think we should have one, and not just have it be the world's largest green room. We've gotten out of the habit of what's supposed to be the first branch of government actually make the rules. And demand that they be enforced. I actually think even though there's some quarrels over exactly what we think the proper standard for impeachment should be, and I think we've degraded that a lot with some of the recent impeachments, I think it's wonderfully good for American civic health to have a cabinet secretary impeached. We should do it more often, and specifically, not impeached for doing his job poorly, or, making some bad discretionary decisions, all of which are perfectly fine subjects for accountability at the ballot box or in a hearing, but for flatly refusing to enforce the law. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of shocking, and of course, a sign of, again, the decay of civic education, even among, say, Americans who have been in high federal office for half a century, that the president's response to discovering that he and his administration are failing to enforce the law is to ask for more laws.
and so that kind of takes us to the end of the current
era. And, we're obviously, things don't change overnight, but it is wholly plausible and obviously on a long enough timeline, inevitable that this era, however defined in politics, will end. Obviously, some of the people that are at the top of that pyramid are more seasoned in age, I think is fair to say. And and soon they will go to their eternal reward, such as it is. In doing so, how do you see us exiting this era? Do you see this as a linear projection to way things are going? This is a spastic fit that we've, just are kind of using to exercise some demons and will return to a general stasis, or, some third option?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict the future, of course. I think history does tell us, though, that an era like this one probably will end in something fairly dramatic that changes people's minds in a hurry. I mean, look, the populist.
Would a Lions Super Bowl qualify as that?
Well, we didn't quite get there, but
we're getting close.
But yeah, I mean, look, they said men would walk on the moon before the Mets won the World Series, and that the Cubs would win the World Series before Donald Trump gets elected president. Well, both of those things turned out to be true. So yeah, I was actually looking forward to the Lions getting in the Super Bowl just for that kind of let's really spin the wheel and see what happens in this timeline. I mean, the populist era of the 1890s, which became then the progressive era, it ended in the First World War, frankly. And so, I think eras in the past that have had these kind of enthusiasms, something comes along to remind people that they've got bigger things to worry about.
That's a great encapsulation, I think, of where we're... I would say the question mark that exists over the next 10, 15, 20 years. But let me ask you on a specific application, because you've written about this a lot, specifically on the effort now, out of Colorado, out of Maine, which I think is even less defensible, to basically eliminate President Trump from the ballot. Why you have been very, very critical about that.
Yeah, and I think, I've been critical in a way that is maybe different from other people. I think it's completely legitimate for them to be doing this. I just think they're wrong. I think I think frankly that the Supreme Court's not going to stand for it. There's probably at most one vote. Sotomayor seems the only justice whose vote is even in question as far as whether she would vote to disqualify Trump. But I have a suspicion the court is going to get it wrong. I think the 14th Amendment is self-executing. I think the states do have the power and indeed the duty to disqualify candidates who have engaged in insurrection. I don't think that the amendment as it is written requires a criminal conviction to do that. I don't think Congress has required there to be a criminal conviction to do that. I'm not terribly persuaded by the argument that the language of the amendment doesn't cover the president or the presidency. But all that being said, there is a fixed meaning, a fixed and discernible meaning to the text when it says engaged in insurrection, and it's not what Trump did. Sort of rage tweeting from your couch while the insurrection's going on is not the same thing as storming the barricades. It's not the same thing as providing, literally material aid to an ongoing insurrection. The cases that Congress decided in the late 1860s about who to seat, who not to seat, they drew a pretty clear line, and they were the ones who had written the amendment saying, look, political incitement before the fact is not engaging in insurrection.
Well, Dan, this kind of brings us to the end of the program. I want to make sure we reserve some time for question and answers with this great discussion that we've had. But I want to pose one question before we open it up, and that is a two-parter. Is one, I want you essentially to give me a reason that justifies a pessimistic outlook. But then the follow-up to that is then I want a reason why optimism should prevail.
Yeah, well, the pessimistic outlook, I mean, my biggest source of pessimism right now is very much Trump related, and it's the sense that there's a great window of opportunity right now that for the conservative movement and the Republican Party and the country and that I think we may miss that window of opportunity because we're so consumed in the drama of one man, and that drama puts people off who might otherwise join our cause. And I mean, I think it kind of, it sort of blots out the sun a little bit. And you want, one of the things, for example, I think there's an enormous, in the electorate, what I've been calling a youth dividend, which is that people have been sitting through these geriatric leaders, and the first time somebody comes forward with somebody who's not, that they're going to have a big opportunity. And it's sad for the Democratic Party that they didn't even give their voters that choice. And it's sad for the Republican Party that they did give their voters that choice and they didn't take it. And so here we are. And, you can't always recapture a missed moment. To be optimistic, other than the obvious fact that our current two political party leaders actuarially will not be with us forever, and constitutionally, at least one of them will be eliminated from ever running again by this election. I mean, that's the part of the optimistic case. And the other is just that, progressivism doesn't work. And the longer people see it at work, I mean, if you look at what the political landscape looked like in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, and even with Nixon in office, sometimes especially with Nixon in office, there were all sorts of reasons to think that there was no hope. Here you have, this hegemony of liberalism astride the American economy and foreign policy. And you looked at the next generation coming up, and it was the barbarians at the gates, the boomers. The boomers are going to be, they're going to be so far left. They've all voted for McGovern, right? And Jimmy Carter in 1976 is only one of two candidates in the history of public opinion polling, Barack Obama is the other, to win a presidential election while losing voters over the age of 30, right? Because, the baby boom generation was turning, the oldest members of the generation were just hitting 30 in 1976. So there was every reason to believe that things were not only politically bad, philosophically bad, economically bad, but that demographically they were going to get worse. And they didn't. So, there is always hope.
Well, I really appreciate that perspective, Dan, and thank you so much for sharing it. What I'd like to do now is just open up a question and answers for folks here. Just make sure that when you raise your hand, wait till Erica gets to you with the microphone, just so that any folks watching from our remote offices are able to hear what your question is as well. Andrew.
Dan, thank you very much for being here, and I really appreciated the discussion you had about fusionism. It's a philosophy that profoundly influenced my development as a conservative, and one of the things in the current battle for the soul of conservatism that's going on right now, I'm seeing fusionism has become a dirty word in some circles. Is fusionism dead, or if not, do we need a new fusionism? And if so, what would that look like? What comes out of that process at the end?
I think a new fusionism is kind of where we're headed and where we should be headed, but it doesn't have to be philosophically all that different from the old one. I think it just has to be thought through in a way that applies to a new set of circumstances. I mean, our philosophy is not that different from the philosophy of the conservatives of the 1920s or the classical liberals and conservatives of the 1860s, but it applied to a different set of circumstances, dealt with different problems, and it had to think about some specific things differently. So I think things can be rethought, re-argued from first principles with an understanding that conservatism is a philosophy. It's not an ideology. It can contain ideologies, but it's a philosophy. And that philosophy allows you to combine different elements of your first principles differently in different circumstances, because conservatism is all about experience, all about the real world.
Excellent.
Christian? Oh, Eddie's bringing it around.
Thanks so much for everything from your Twitter to this talk. I'm curious, how much would you say the influence of the new...
You on?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you go.
Okay. I'm just a loud person. How much would you say the influence of the kind of new right, the Sarabamarianism, the compactism, is influenced by the sort of domination of Marxism, of like socialist communist ideology in the college campus, and that's the people who are being taught that are still conservative by nature, but they're getting an intellectual tradition that's collectivist and that doesn't believe in free markets.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the thing about the new right, other than the fact that it's more accurately described as like the new right, because we've been through so many new rights over the years, but it's also not one. There's not just one of it, and that's also something that's been a constant throughout conservative history is that you see what maybe from a distance looks like a unified movement, and the closer you get to it, it's there's people bickering back and forth over small differences. And so, I think that a lot of the people who are coming up with sort of their own personal philosophies don't necessarily all agree with each other. And that gets me back again to my point, leadership matters. Because it's when somebody is able to marshal all of this together, and put it into, a public philosophy and a movement. The higher up the leadership ladder you get, the more unification there is around what exactly the principles are.
Aaron, right over here.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. My question comes from a place of sort of the world of education, right? Which is where I work. So we're seeing this huge wave of the school choice movement just sweeping the country. It's taking hold in ways we've never seen it before. At the same time, there's this small c conservative impulse to reform existing institutions, right, rather than build new ones. Could you talk to that tension and how we in our own personal lives should approach reforming an institution we love and care about and has a long history of existence rather than starting a new one? What are the risks and rewards of both?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot. I thought about it going back all the way to when I was in college, and they decided on our campus to found a conservative paper, but I had a position as a weekly op-ed columnist in the main campus paper, and I thought, you know what, I've got a bigger audience here. Why am I going to do that? So I stayed where I was. I think it is unpredictable again to see exactly where, there's this counter reaction, right? We had the long march through the institutions of the left, and now things like school choice are in a sense the right saying we need a long march out of the institutions. But there is still value in those existing institutions. And I try to think of it as like the Illinois Nazi problem, right? Like, think of it this way. Like, let's say you were the governor of Illinois. Let's say you were a normal, sane governor of Illinois.
So one of them that ends up in prison or not?
Yeah, well, yeah, this is, let's say, like, one out of three who doesn't go to prison. But anyway, let's say you're the governor of Illinois and you look into the Illinois school system and you discover that the public school system, from the lowest grades to the top of the state university system, is entirely dominated by the American Nazi Party. And that they will find ways to not hire anybody who does not subscribe to the tenets of American National Socialism. Are you obliged to be completely content neutral in every way that you handle that? Or do you have a civic obligation to do something about it? And is that obligation limited to, we have to burn down the entire Illinois school system and start a new one because we're not allowed to fire half or more of the people who work there in order to, for the system to reflect the opinions of the good people of Illinois? And that's when you get into like the constitutional theories and stuff, it's a tough question. But I think clearly there are institutions that are beyond saving. And I think that it's dangerous. I sometimes think of this as a bundling issue, right? Like in economics, you talk about bundling, right? You buy two products together, and sometimes if you have market power, like in antitrust law, if you have market power in one product, you can force people to buy some other thing they don't want to go with it. And I think so much of where you see the concentration of this nutty leftism is in bundled situations where they're able to say like, oh, you like going to Disney World? Here, take some transgender ideology with that. Oh, you want to send your kid to Harvard? Well, you have two choices. You can build a new Harvard that'll only take 400 years, or you can just suck it up and go there. And that's why, by the way, that's why Bud Light got hit so hard, because it's really not that hard to change beers. It's why, like the airlines or some other product that's an intensely competitive market, you see a lot less of this nonsense because they know that it's really easy for people to walk away because they're not selling you a unique product that is wrapped into the institutional capital of something that's been built for a long time. 19th century Americans didn't have this problem. Henry Raymond didn't like the two big newspapers in New York. He started the New York Times, 1851. Leland Stanford could start his own university. Like, we don't do enough of that anymore. And I think we do need to do some of it, but I think some of it is also we need to do some of it, pour encourager les autres, right? Like you see enough new institutions that take a bite out of the existing ones and it gets people's attention.
That's a very, very good point. Monty.
Thank you for being here. I would be remiss if I didn't get a chance to ask a baseball question. Do you think guys like Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire belong in the Hall of Fame, or do you think they should stay not in?
This might be the most controversial question yet.
I know, right?
Yes. I think it makes a mockery of the Hall of Fame that Bonds and Clemens aren't there. I think the only guys who should be out on that moral basis are Joe Jackson and the other 1919 Black Sox conspirators, because they violated the one absolutely unbreakable rule in baseball, which is you try to win, right? Pete Rose bet on his team. There's good reasons he was banned from active involvement in the game, but if you ever watched Pete Rose play or manage, that guy played every inning of every game, ran at every walk, like he had money riding on it, because as it turned out, often he did.
So to speak.
But Rose played more baseball games than anybody else in the game's history, and he played every second of every one of those to win. Bonds was cheating. He was breaking the law. He was trying to win. And there's lots of guys in the Hall of Fame who did that. Now, I think it clearly illustrates to put it in philosophical terms, though, baseball failed to enforce its own rules. And competitors in a game are going to get away with whatever you let them get away with. There is a lesson there about law, right? When people see that the law is held in contempt by the people in charge, they will do what's in their best interests. And I think it's totally fair when you give notice to people that these are the rules and they're going to be enforced and you get suspended and you miss a season. Well, that's fair. That's good. But the people who competed under the conditions as they were, I think people are realistic about. I think fans are realistic about the fact that that's always gone on. You got guys in the Hall of Fame who threw illegal spitballs and corked their bats. Babe Ruth corked his bat. Come on. So yes, you can argue that some of these things are worse in a way morally than other kinds of cheating, but fundamentally, I think the game, it's not the Hall of Integrity; it's the Hall of Fame.
That actually brings us to a great closing point. And now, John, hopefully you got some good stuff to bring to your softball league with that. But that being said, I think that's a great point to actually close up for the day. I want to thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much for participating. But most of all, join me in giving a round of applause to our guest, Dan McLaughlin, for that discussion. Thank you.
And thanks for having me.
Anytime.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that. Just for a minute or two, I want Derek to reflect on what he heard interviewing Dan McLaughlin and what your takeaways were from that interview.
Yeah, so I think we can say, and first and foremost, I don't believe he'll be voting for Mr. Trump. But that all that aside, I think the best discussion back and forth was not only of kind of that founding era of American politics, but specifically what he wrote about, and then we talked about in the discussion with, Tocqueville in France, the French politician, and really kind of, this is the second time I've used this reference today, but basically using France is the absolute lodestar of what not to do in politics in so many ways. But I think that Tocqueville's experience in France really shows the fragility of the American experiment. And I'm one of the ones who make the argument that the American experiment is very robust. I think that our current system of government can survive, and Dan spoke to this as well during the interview. I think that our current system of government can survive far more load-bearing, shocking events than we have thus far, and that even the darkest place of the mind fear to wonder. That being said, keep emerging.
I was going to say that was going to end on a positive note. We always claim we don't do that here.
Oh no, that's another thing. That's why I made sure to ask Dan, in which obviously his answer was a bit tongue in cheek. What justifies a pessimistic outlook in this moment in history? And then number two, give me an optimistic reason to overshadow that. And his answer was very, very telling. And I think that he has a bit cynical about the intermediate future, but not necessarily about the broad long-term future. And I tend to agree with that. I think that we are, again, a very resilient people with a very resilient system of government, and it was nice to be able to have that opportunity to discuss that with an intellect such as his.
So we will leave you hopefully sufficiently fear-mongered and still very concerned about the future of the Republic with that. Well, again, as always, we really appreciate you all watching. We appreciate you all listening to us. And I wasn't able to do all of my normal shameless plugs, so I'll do that here. Please subscribe to The Post. It's a really good newsletter. It's got exclusive content in there. It's always kind of fun, always kind of hot takes on what TPPF is up to and what we're doing, and our takes on the news of the day and the big issues of the day. So we hope you subscribe to that. Again, it's The Post. It's at texaspolicy.com/The Post. And we always like to end the show in the words of Sam Houston: do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.